It is finally here, episode 1 of House of the Dragon season 1. It feels good to say that because now we can finally stop debating what we don't know and begin analyzing what we've seen and form our opinions on that information. Now this particular video will be spoiler free. Look for my spoiler review in just a few days. So my first thoughts initially were visuals. This series has its own look and personality, at least visually. I love the costume design. I think it's very detailed and elaborate. And although there's areas that are CGI heavy, they blend in some more practical and old-fashioned camera work that brought to life some more violent scenes, but allow them to be more grounded scenes as well. This feels like a film even more than like season 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones, where they went really heavy into set pieces and dragons. And I don't feel like we got too many of the dragons on the screen, but when we did, they look fine. It's interesting contrasting this with Game of Thrones. In this timeline, dragons are quite common, and I actually didn't love the way they were introduced, but I also wonder if that's kind of part of it, where they need to feel commonplace, so making it a spectacle to the audience while characters have no special reaction probably wouldn't make a ton of sense. I wasn't disappointed, but I also wasn't impressed. But I'll move along because dragons are not exactly the focus of this episode, and I don't think that they should have been either. Now the episode starts with what I felt was kind of a weird pace. And I understand we need to establish some information and backstory to allow audiences to understand where King's Landing is currently at in this timeline. I wrote in my notes that 15 minutes in, and I felt that there still wasn't any grab the audience in all moments. And I swear, before I could put my pen down, Daemon Targaryen shows up, and wow, he is a force, and Matt Smith, so far, I think is going to be a big deal thanks to his role here in House of the Dragon. I'm not saying he's not a very popular actor, star, etc. But I think this is going to kind of propel him to another level. I'll elaborate in my spoiler review, but his scenes bring a viciousness and tone, and they establish that well with not just how he's perceived by other characters, but the few action sequences in this episode makes it clear that his vibe is brutal. However, he's not one note, and this is displayed subtly enough with an interaction between him and Rhaenyra. I don't have a negative thing to say about the other actors, but Matt Smith really made Daemon pop from the very moment we first see him, in my opinion. One thing I really liked is that they did a good job with seed planting character motives. I think that it'll really enhance this episode on rewatches. There is a small moment between Alicent and her father Otto that I think is very revealing about Otto, and I'll dive more into other moments like that in my spoiler review. Now, the last area I want to cover has a lot to do with this being the premiere episode for the series. If we do compare it to Game of Thrones, was this better or worse? I think it's both for a couple of reasons. There is a prologue in this episode. I just don't think it's as effective as Game of Thrones prologue Beyond the Wall dealing with the White Walkers or the others. Now, is it as important to this specific story as it was Game of Thrones? You can make that argument, but I would say not really. And the reason I think this is kind of a negative is if you're not a book reader, the prologue in House of the Dragon feels like information they could have presented later. Now, in screenwriting or in writing novels, we're typically taught to capture the audience's attention in the very first page, or at least as soon as possible. And again, I'll elaborate in the spoiler review, but I feel that House of the Dragon's opening really would only appeal to book readers mostly. The rest of the audience probably tolerated it because it's a Game of Thrones prequel, and if you started watching, you're probably going to keep watching at least this episode. Now, opinions may vary. That's just kind of the feeling that I got watching that. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Now, the middle of this episode really shows a ton of promise, and it really starts with Daemon's introduction and lasts all the way until the end. I think a lot of audiences will be fascinated with Daemon and also the council meetings. They sprinkle a lot of hints as far as rivals. They do develop Viserys a bit more, and even knowing what's going to happen, I was still emotionally uneasy in the way a certain moment happened. And they intercut a more intimate scene with an action sequence simultaneously, and the underlying commentary is subtle, but I think it worked, and I think it's going to work even better on rewatches. I'd say compared to Game of Thrones, the second and third act is a little better in House of the Dragon. However, I really love the ending of episode 1 for Game of Thrones. I think it insisted that you come back for episode 2. While there's two significant moments at the end of House of the Dragon, one is a callback or reference to A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones that I don't know will actually matter or play a role in this particular story. And the second moment is significant, but it's not world-changing like Bran being shoved from the tower. This episode leaves me intrigued for more, for sure, but like a few other reviewers, I would have liked to see a cliffhanger to attract more audiences to follow up in episode 2. Other than that, in the prologue, I really love how they paced this episode out. So overall, am I blown away? Not really. Am I disappointed? No. It's not incredible, but it works for the very first episode. And because I thought for this particular series, if there were fundamental problems, they would appear in this first episode. I believe that. Since no real story structure issues present themselves, I walk away feeling happy that there's much more good than bad, and I'm excited for episode 2. Now I'll have my spoiler review ready for you guys in a few days. In the meantime, if you like this video or found it useful, please leave it a like. And if you're new, make sure you subscribe and turn on your notifications so you don't miss more House of the Dragon content coming soon.